All right, welcome to Christ the King. We're going to go ahead and start by standing and singing Show Us Christ, and Paul's going to come afterwards, and he's going to bring God's Word to us this morning. Glad that you all are here, and so as we draw near to God with worship, let's bear these words in our minds as we go through them. All right, show us Christ, and let's sing together.
Cool, welcome. I want to mention something, a couple of things here, and then so people on Facebook Live hear about it too. Michelle is having some surgery this week on her foot, and she's gonna be under the not under the weather. What's the word? Incapacitated for a while, and we thought it would be good if maybe we could help provide some meals for her for the next whatever period of time.
Yeah.
So Beth, I think, is going to kind of organize that maybe and talk to her, and then I wanted to mention my granddaughter has a massive bloody nose, so she went home. So anyway, so other than that, everything's good, right? Good to have Dave Gerald back. Dave Gerald has been in CDL training for 8 weeks and successfully passed his CDL. So
does that mean he's going to be as weird as you are?
Going to be weird as me, yeah. And
sorry, Dave.
Going to have issues.
Oh, I already was.
So yeah.
You've got a little.
So welcome to Facebook Live, and just kind of give you a little schedule what's going on. Caleb, for some reason, his wife want to get away for the weekend, so they're going to go away next week, and we have. Was I not to say that?
No, yeah, you're fine.
Okay.
I'm from Chicago.
You blinked on me?
I did, absolutely.
Yeah.
Back it up.
Anyway, they're going away next week for a little getaway to Chicago, and he was going to finish up Ruth next week. So we are going to postpone that. He's going to do it when he comes back. And next week, since it's Memorial Day, I thought it would be kind of fun to do a Memorial Day theme for that Sunday. I haven't decided what to do as far as the message, but I think I may look in the Bible on, do a word search on remember and see where that leads. And so we'll do that next week, and then he'll come back on June, whatever that is, which would be the 8th, right?
It'll be the second.
Second. I have something really cool this year.
The second.
I'm sorry.
You're not,
I'm sorry.
you do not have the floor. The chair does not give you the floor.
I'm so sorry.
Anyway, he's going to finish Ruth, and then we're going to move on to Hebrews after that. Okay, yes.
I'm sorry. It just popped in my mind and my mouth flew open. I
Yeah.
apologize for interrupting you.
Yeah.
But my little granddaughter, CJ, who's been here, is
Right.
going to be baptized on June 2nd.
Okay.
Awesome.
She made a profession of faith in the little Nazarene church down in Lancaster.
Okay, great. Yeah, great.
Great.
All right. So, anyway, we're gonna. That's kind of our plan over the next few weeks. I'm looking forward to Hebrews. I think that'll be a good book to go into. I don't know if you wonder how I ever come up with where I'm going next, and it's. I do pray about stuff like that, but it's kind of what interests me, and I kind of think that's how God leads, right? What are you interested in? So that's what we're going to do. We did Ruth this time because my lovely wife Beth thought it would be good to do Ruth. We were going to do a video blog on the way to church today, but she didn't want to do it, so it's her fault. Then she volunteered to do it. I'm in trouble, aren't I?
What other wives are you going to throw under the bus? I'm getting nervous. You're next, Cheryl. I'm getting it from my husband.
Beth, Cheryl, and Cassie, all under the bus this morning. But we're going to continue with Ruth chapter 2. And last week, as we began, we did a focused on Naomi and Mother's Day and what a special lady she was. And today I want to focus on Ruth herself and the woman of character that she was. And I want to use her life and the way she conducted her life as a way to encourage us on what it means to be a person of character. Then when there's a messianic message in the book of Ruth that deals with the subject of the kinsman redeemer, and that is what Caleb is going to deal with in a couple of weeks, that whole concept. But I wanted to look today at Ruth, this amazing woman of character, and I think that there are some lessons here. I actually have 4 lessons here that I want to share with you that I think really fit from her life that would fit in our lives. To me, being a person of character is extremely important. And what is character? Does it mean you're perfect? No. Does it mean you don't ever make mistakes? No. But character is something that I think is vital. To be a genuine person and to be the real deal. And we want Christ the King Community Church to be that. Not perfect and not comparing ourselves with other churches. I don't do that. But rather to be genuine and real, and so that we have a powerful testimony. I found in my own experience, limited as it might be, that when you're open and honest, for example, about your past, and you're genuine, you're real with that, people are saying, okay, we all make mistakes, right? We all make mistakes. If they know you're genuine and they know you're real. And you can be even a person of character and maybe be blunt or not always do things perfectly like you like maybe you'd want to. But we see in Ruth this amazing story. Now the book of Ruth has as its background some cultural things that happened in the Old Testament that may, when we look at them, seem a little strange to us. One of the things that the Old Testament was really clear on was that the importance of having a lineage or offspring and continuing the family name. We're not so much into that, I don't think, in this culture. But for example, if a woman was widowed, the next of kin was to come in and to marry her if that man was available, obviously. And the first child born to that union was to carry on the name of the deceased father. And so we don't think that way. But that's the story of Ruth and Boaz. As like I said, Caleb will deal with that a little more next week, or in a couple weeks. But we see in Ruth this amazing story, this amazing woman, and it begins in Ruth chapter 1, which we looked at last week, where Ruth, remember the story, Naomi leaves Bethlehem because of a period of famine in the land, and her husband go to Moab, and because there's food there, and they go to find a better life, and they're there 10 years, and Naomi's husband dies, Elimelech. Her 2 boys marry 2 Moabite women, which, by the way, was prohibited in Old Testament Jewish law and in Mosaic law. But they married 2 Moabite women. One is Orpah, and the other is Ruth. And Naomi hears about how things are better back home in Bethlehem, and she decides that she's going to return home and back to her hometown. And she tells her daughter-in-laws, look, girls, I'm leaving, and I think you should go home back to your family. I'm not going to have any more sons that are going to be able to be born and raised. And even if I do, you'd be far too old to marry them anyway, so why don't you stay here? And at first they both say, no, we're going with you. We love you. We're going with you. And she continues to discuss it with them. And finally, Orpah decides that she's going to go back to her family, which makes sense, right? Humanly speaking, it makes a lot of sense. But Ruth says no, and she says this very famous statement to her mother-in-law, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. And then there's this famous phrase, a passage from Ruth, for where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people. And then this important phrase, your God, my God. She's converted, right? And she says, your God, my God, and where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord, do so to me and more, if anything but death parts me from you. Think about that statement, right? That's loyalty, isn't it? Where you go, I'll go. Your people, my people. Your God, my God. And where you die, I will die. And basically, God curse me if I don't do this, is what she says. And so Ruth goes, and it has a fantastic ending to the story that happens to her down the road. But we see this loyalty. And when we get to chapter 2, there are 4 lessons, observations that I want to make about Ruth, and I think is important for us to understand. The first lesson is that Ruth lived in the moment. She lived in the presence. And by that I mean she was not paralyzed by the past, and she was not afraid of the future. She had lost her husband, right? And so what does she do when she first gets back to Bethlehem with her mother-in-law? The first thing she does is go, we got to eat. We got to eat. And so what does she do? She goes out and gleans in the fields and gathers grain for her and Naomi. It was instructed in the Mosaic law that if you had a field of grain and you harvested it, you were to leave some on the edges or in the field for the poor to come if they wanted to and pick the grain and be able to provide for their family. And so she gets home and she says I'm gonna go out and I'm gonna pick the grain and I'm going to help support my mother-in-law. The statement that she said in that I just read in chapter 1, the statement she said, she meant it, didn't she? And so she said, I'm going to go out. You never see in Ruth a victim. You never see a victim in Ruth. Think about this. She's lost her husband. We don't know how her husband died. We don't know how Naomi's husband died. We don't know how the sons died. We know anything about that. But she's a widow. She leaves her home, and the Israelites and the Moabites were not particularly fond of one another. And so there would be that tension. So she leaves her her family. She leaves her home and she goes to Bethlehem in southern Israel. And immediately, what does she do? She decides, I've got to provide. She doesn't look back. She's not paralyzed by the past. She's not grieving. She's kind of a get-her-done girl. So she goes out. She's also not afraid of the future. And I was thinking about this concept about living in the moment. You know, in Matthew 6 in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, don't worry about tomorrow. Why? Because there's a whole lot of bad stuff. Don't worry about it. There's enough trouble today. Don't worry about tomorrow. What do we tend to do? Depending on your personality, right? If you're a think-ahead person like I am, you'll worry about everything. I'm the most optimistic pessimist you've ever met, right? And you tend to blow things out of proportion. Well, what if this goes wrong? And what if that goes wrong? And what are we going to do next week? And that. Or you're paralyzed by our past. You look back at your life and you go, man, I wish I'd have done this. Or I wish I'd have done this different. Or so-and-so hurt me a number of years ago and I can't get over it. Or I failed so miserably, God will never use me. And we're paralyzed by the past. You've been hurt. If you've lived any length of time, right, you've been hurt by somebody. And forgiveness is something that is important. There is no such legitimate concept as forgive and forget. You can't forget, but you can forgive. And you can over time forgive, and it may take a number of years to get over, but it's that process of healing that takes place, right? And so I run into people on occasion. They say, "Well, God can never forgive me because this is what I've done." Well, yeah, He can. Not only can He does. And you look at your past, and we become paralyzed. Ruth was not that way. Okay. I left home, I lost my family, I lost my husband, I'm a widow, I got to find food. So she went out and began to work in the fields. She also appeared to be afraid of the future. Are you afraid of the future? Sometimes we are, aren't we? Uncertainty. So that was the first lesson. The second story, lesson from this passage that I want to talk about, and we talked a lot about this in Ephesians, and that is the story of Ruth shows the sovereignty of God in the lives of us, that God is in control. One of the most comforting doctrines that I find in Scripture is that God is in control. We may look around and say, I wonder if He is. I wonder if He knows what He's doing, because I wouldn't do it this way. But He's in control. And we see this in Ruth chapter 2, verses 1 and 3. Now Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, which that was Naomi's husband, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him, in whose sight I shall find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And then notice this phrase, she happened to come to the field, part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was a part of the clan of Elimelech. She happened to stumble into the field of Elimelech. She happened to? She didn't plan to. I had a chance in the 80s to go to Israel on a real quick trip, and I really enjoyed the trip. I really enjoyed being in Israel. And I didn't care anything about the shrines, the Temple of the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Nativity. You get in this hole and they say, well, this is where Jesus was born, and it's got all this stuff around it. I didn't find those things interesting. What I found interesting was the land, the land itself. To go down to En-Gedi, where David, hid from Saul, and to see those cliffs where he hid, and imagine him in those cliffs, and going along the Sea of Galilee, and the area where they believe Jesus did the Sermon on the Mount. There's nothing there but this sloping hill down to the sea, which Galilee's not really so much a sea as it is a lake, big lake, right? And the one thing that I also found interesting was when we went to Bethlehem. Because when you come to Bethlehem in the way that we came, and I don't know which direction, I think from the east, Bethlehem sits up on a pretty significant hill. And as you approach Bethlehem, there's these fields. And as we were on the tour bus, a shepherd of all things with his sheep was in the road. And he had what you'd think was the shepherd had. You know, he had the thing on his head and the long robes and the staff. And he was leading the sheep. And from across the road from one field to the next. And so you can imagine, I can imagine, for example, one of those fields being actually Boaz's field. And so Ruth goes out and says she happened to come to a part of the field belonging to Boaz. Well, that's the way it appeared, correct? She happened. And it demonstrates to me that, well, yeah, why she may have happened to do that, God in his providence and in his sovereignty ordained that she stumble into that field. And the sovereignty of God, I talked about this in Ephesians, I think becomes a divisive doctrine for whatever reason a lot of times, because we try to figure it all out. We try to figure out everything about it, and so then we get in an argument. You know, we get in an argument over it, and all I know in the sovereignty of God is He's in control. And I believe that, and I find confidence in that. So when you're stumbling along through life, right? When you're stumbling along through life and a big wall comes up in your face, and you say, why did that that obstacle happen? I don't know. And then there's always someone that said, well, you know, someday you'll know. Well, you know what? Maybe someday you won't know, and someday it won't matter. You know, I tell people, or I think about this, when you get to heaven, got a list, right? I got a list of all the questions I'm going to ask God for him to explain to me why these things happen. And I've got it in my pocket, okay? And I walk in the door of heaven, and here's what's going to happen to me. I think you're going to go, who cares? Who cares, right? I got to lean over and get that. Will this be on camera?
I'll cover them if you want me to.
So that God's in control. It is so comforting if you grasp that concept. And we use the mantra around here, love God, love people, and live our lives. And I've never met anybody who's had a perfect life, right? But if you understand that God, I don't know how he does it. I don't know how he works it, plans it. I just know he's in charge. Ruth didn't happen to stumble into the field of Boaz. Right? She just went out looking for grain. And it opened an amazing door to her. And God used her, used that story. So she lived in the moment. Her story shows the sovereignty of God. And the third principle that I sometimes think we lose sight of, Ruth's faithfulness reaped reward.
Amen.
Her faithfulness reaped reward. And it says in Ruth chapter 2, 11 and 12, but Boaz answered her, all that you have done. She made a positive impression on Boaz. For all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land and came to a people that you did not know. Her reputation. And Boaz was a rich dude, and he helped her out. But then notice this, the Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. God rewarded Ruth for her faithfulness, didn't he? And she ultimately was married Boaz. Again, I won't preach Caleb's message, but she ultimately married Boaz and had a little boy. And that little boy had a little boy, if I get this right. And that little boy had a little boy. And that little boy had a little boy, and that little boy's name was David, King David. And David's little boys down the road, many boys down the road, there was a little boy born in Bethlehem. Notice this. Where's Boaz from? That little boy was born in a manger. His name was Jesus, and he's the one we serve and love. And Ruth, the Moabitess, who didn't even really fit into the plan, became a mother in the line of the lineage of Jesus Christ. Does God reward faithfulness? And I think the thing that we sometimes, at least I do, maybe you don't, but sometimes I think what happens to us is that we become so temporal that what we see is, okay, today is May whatever it is, 18th, 2019, and what? Today's the 19th? Okay, today's the 19th. And we become so wrapped around. I'm excited about today because I love coming here, and we're going to go to B-Dubs after church, which is always a highlight. And we look forward to these things, and we become so temporal. Tomorrow I'm going to get up, go get in that Peterbilt, and go up north. And then we're looking ahead at vacations, right? We become so wrapped up. You're going off for a romantic weekend in Chicago. And
With Weston.
and so we become, and it's the way we do, right? Way we do, right?
The Baptist conference is in June, too, you know.
Huh?
The Baptist conference is in June.
Yeah, we're going out into Seattle in June. The Clemenson family vacation in September to go out to watch the Seahawks obliterate the Bengals in the opening game. So we become so. I just ruined it, didn't I? Oh, I saw that.
I saw that hint.
But you know, or we look at promotions, we look at our job situation, we get a promotion. We become so wrapped up in the present, in the sense of that we become so temporal, we forget that what God is looking at is that someday we're going to walk through into heaven, right? And God's going to reward our faithfulness. I heard a guy years ago do a conference called, and it was called AL Alive. It was that, what do you call that when the first word?
Acrostic.
Yeah, alive. Always living in view of eternity. To live our lives in view of eternity. Doesn't mean that we can't enjoy the now. Doesn't mean that we can, that the now doesn't matter. But to remember that God's going to reward us one day for our faithfulness. I don't know how he's going to do it. There's going to be like gobs of people there. I don't think he's going to stand up and say, hey, get your certificate at the back, find your name, it'll be alphabetized. And you've got a little plaque there you can take home and put it up on the wall. And then you know, Cheryl will have 4 plaques and I'll have 2, and she'll point that out to me. You know, I don't think that's what it's going to be. But there's going to be this special moment someday, and that's described to us, and I didn't tell you this, Kim, I don't know if you can do it quick, but 1 Corinthians 3, if you can't, I can read it. 1 Corinthians 3, 5 through 15.
Yeah,
Can you find that quick?
not that quick.
Okay, don't worry about it. The Corinthian church was a mess, right? It was a mess. They had every problem under the book, and they were arguing over who was the best person to follow. And Paul wrote these words. What then is? He said, "I follow." Some were saying, "I follow Paul," and the others were saying, "I follow Apollos." There was jealousy, and then he says, "What then is Apollos? What is Paul? Servants through whom you believed, as the Lord assigned to each. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the growth. So neither he who plants or he who waters is anything, but only God who gives the growth. He who plants and he who waters are one. Each will receive his wages according to his labor. For we are God's fellow workers. You are God's field and God's building." What he's saying is, doesn't matter in this life what each of us do for Jesus. We're all on the same team, right? I have decided, and I refuse to be jealous of any other ministry. Just not going to do it. You know, someone else is doing better than I am, fine. I refuse to be that. And when I get jealous, God rebukes, and I listen. But then he says this, according to God, the grace of God given to me like a skilled master builder, I laid the foundation, someone else is building upon it. Let each one take care how he builds this, for no one can lay a foundation other than that which is laid, which is Jesus Christ. Now if anyone builds on the foundation with gold, silver, precious stones, wood, hay, and straw, each one's work will become manifest, for the day will disclose it, because it will be revealed by fire, and the fire will test what sort of work each one has done. If the work that anyone has built on the foundation survives, he will receive a reward. If anyone's work is burned up, he will suffer loss, though he himself will be saved, but only as through fire. We are building God's building, right? The kingdom. We're building his kingdom. Whether you're stuck over in the corner painting the trim, or you're involved in the superstructure, we're all building a building. And what it says here is that one day God's going to, and this is in the analogy, God's going to have a big fire, going to burn that building, and there's going to be left stuff that lasts. And that's what he's going to reward. And so it's possible that those who built a big building and had a big show may or may not have anything in those days. I'm not saying they won't. They may or may not. But we're going to be rewarded. You know, there's another section in the scripture that talks about how we will cast our crowns at Jesus' feet. Here's what I think is going to happen. I don't think the Bible teaches this, but I think this is what is going to happen. We'll have our little basket, right? God will hand out the crowns. Now, just work with me on this. You'll have your little basket with crowns, okay, that he's put in there. You know, Don, you did this. I'm giving you this crown. And Caleb, you did this. Here's a crown. So we have a little bucket of crowns. We're going to be so overwhelmed with the greatness of God, we're going to say, these aren't worth anything. I'm just going to throw them down at your feet. I'm just glad to be in the front door. I'm just so glad to be in the front door. But the point is that God is going to reward us for our faithfulness. So hang on to that. So if we never get rewarded in this life for anything, which doesn't happen, you just keep on loving God, loving people, and living life. And be faithful in that. And God will take care of it. That's also very comforting. And then the final thing is, and this is something that has become very passionate with me, and I may be stretching this a bit to use this as an example from Ruth, but I think Ruth is a perfect example of what genuine discipleship is all about. And I got a couple of passages here. And he said, this is Jesus said to all, if anyone would come after him, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in his glory, and the glory of the Father and of the holy angels. But I tell you truly, there are some here standing today who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God. What is discipleship in the mind of Jesus? Total self-denial and a devoted following of Jesus. Now, does that mean, like some misinterpreted over the years, that we go up and live in a monastery and we don't have anything? No. Does it mean that we become monastic and we live total lives of poverty and we can't enjoy life and we can't have things and we can't enjoy vacations? And no. But it's a total and complete commitment to Christ. And that's why in our mantra that at least means something to me, the living life is, it means the 168 hours a week that I live are devoted to Jesus. Whether it's playing golf, or whether it's working, or whether it's reading my Bible, or whether it's coming to gatherings like this, everything I do, I'm devoted to Christ. And I deny myself how often? Daily. And if you're a sinner, like we all are, you may go a few days and not deny yourself, But when you recognize you haven't denied yourself, you get back on track. And then Paul's words from Galatians chapter 2 and verse 20, I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And the life that I now live in the flesh, and the word flesh there doesn't mean bad things, but the life that I now live in my body form, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. I have been crucified with Christ. Nevertheless I live. That's living life. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. Total devotion. That's faithfulness. That's faithfulness. It's putting aside my own selfish ambitions and everything that's important to me and putting Jesus Christ first in my life. That's what he says. And I've said this many times because I'm passionate about it. Jesus is not something you add to your life like you get a new car or a new house. It's not something you say, well, I'm going to get a flat screen and get me some Jesus. No, Jesus is all our life should be. That's what he's looking for. And we're not talking about a legalistic Christianity where we have a bunch of rules. You got to do this, you got to do that, you got to do the other thing, and if you don't do that, you're not committed to Christ. No, I don't know what commitment to Christ in your life means. I don't. In other words, what you should do. I don't know what you should do for Jesus. I wouldn't try to micromanage that. I just know that whatever we do, we should do all to the glory of God. It ought to be a passion for us. It ought to be something that consumes us, not as some religious fanatics, being obnoxious about our faith, but we ought to, whether we're verbose and can talk to people or whether we're quiet and reserved, our whole lives ought to be devoted completely to the realization of the importance of following Jesus. Jesus did not say, go into all the world and draw a crowd. He said, go into all the world and make it disciples. And when Jesus drew a crowd, he ran them most off. Most of them he ran off. How did he do it? He said weird things like this. You can't be my disciple if you don't deny yourself. Take up your cross daily and follow me. And then the other part of that I like, and I quote all the time, Jesus says, talks about his yoke and his burden. And what does he say? Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for my burden is easy. No, my burden is, one is easy, the other's light. My yoke is easy, and my burden is light. And there's nothing greater than a committed life to Christ. There's nothing better. There's nothing better, because what it does for us in the midst of our adverse circumstances, he gives us the ability to laugh and to get through it. I wouldn't trade it for anything. A life committed to Christ. So anyway, 4 lessons from Ruth. She lived in the moment. She wasn't paralyzed by the past. I know you've all messed it up at one point, except probably you. You're too young. But you will. Weston hasn't either, probably, right?
He has.
Yes. If you've lived any period of time, you've either messed it up, or someone has abused you, or somebody has hurt you, or failed you, or whatever. Something has happened to you. Don't be paralyzed by that, and try not to worry about the future. Live in the moment. That's number 1. 2, remember God's in control. No matter what happens, God's in control. Secondly, faithfulness is rewarded by God. He's going to reward you. You're going to get that basket someday of the little plaques, however that works. Now we're going to throw them all at the feet of Jesus. And then finally, she's the perfect example of discipleship. That's good stuff, even though I said it, right? Why did I ruin it by saying that? I apologize. But I think that's really the key of one of the lessons and observations we learned from the book of Ruth. Again, next week we'll do a Memorial Day thing, and then in 2 weeks we'll complete it. Caleb will complete the book of Ruth. Let us pray. Dave, it's good to have you back. Would you close us in prayer for our this time, and then we'll say goodbye to Facebook Live.
Dear Father, we thank you so much for giving us your word. Lord, we thank you for bringing us here together so that we can fellowship, love one another, and encourage one another. Lord, we thank you for bringing us all safely today. We ask that you would just help us to continue in thoughts of your word and to be blessed by them. And Lord, we just ask that you would send us all out safely today and continue to love and encourage all those that we come in contact with. In the precious name of your Son, Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Okay, we'll say goodbye. We'll see you next week. And Caleb is going to come.